I'm Deb Krause, and I am very happy to be gathered with my colleague, Adam Ployd, who is our assistant professor of historical theology here at Eden, to have a conversation about his scholarship and teaching and about the resources of historical theology for the church, for ministry, for ministries that have a passion and a calling for social justice, and for the moment in which we find ourselves in these days. So Adam, it's great to be gathered with you. Let's just open by giving you some space to share what it is you find a part of your calling to be as a professor at Eden Seminary.
Well, I think as a professor at Eden Seminary, you have the benefit of being able to teach the things you're passionate and love in a way that makes them matter, right? Especially as, you know, a historical theologian and church historian and all this stuff, studying the 4th and 5th century, it's very easy to get caught up in the abstract, esoteric stuff of your own field. And one of the benefits of being a part of the Eden community is you're constantly invited, encouraged, and even pushed to make sure that you're doing things that are relevant for the students in the context that they and we find ourselves now. So for instance, when I first started teaching a survey class on church history, you know, I would just go through the basic things that any generic church history class would have. And as I got to know my students and our context more, I began to shift it in a way that I thought might benefit them in their ministries, as various as those are. And so, for instance, this semester, I'm going to be teaching church history using novels from a wide global context, from the Middle East, from Japan, from Nicaragua and other places throughout the world. And these will replace a lot of the primary texts that I love so dearly. But I've realized that my role, my call as a professor is not necessarily to create people who look and think just like me, but to empower these students who want to be part of God's redemptive work in the world to think contextually, to think beyond their own expression of Christianity, to allow themselves to be ecumenical, to be interfaith, to be thinking about the way their Christian faith is connected to issues of oppression and resilience. And so I think that these novels, which have a post-colonial flair, will allow us to talk about everything from the 2nd century up to the 20th century, but it'll do it in a way that I hope engages them, bringing them into the material so that they can use it to think about the church's role in this context or in whatever context they might find themselves.
Can you give us an example of what that would look like?
So the first novel we're going to do is The Baghdad Eucharist, which is written, or it takes place after the American invasion of Iraq in 2003. And it is told from the perspective of a Chaldean Christian family who is dealing with the rise of more militant Islam within Iraq. And it's all about memory. And it's all about the way the older generations are able to remember and celebrate a life before this, where there was the possibility of interfaith collegiality and kind of a peace. And the younger generation really only knows war. And so they're unable to imagine a way of being Christian that isn't in conflict. Right. And so I use this as the opener because it provides a way to talk about memory and the past as something that is fluid in the way in which we tell it and how it relates to us. And so this then invites students to think not only about the long 2,000 years of church history, but also about their own sense of their Christian past, and what Christianity looks like for those students from the United States, what it looks like now, what people in their congregations or in their institutions are going to understand it, and how those create conversations that are difficult but fruitful.
We are just 1 week almost out from the siege of the Capitol on January 6th. So what do we do in this moment, and how can we draw on historical theology and the resources of that, perhaps even in Augustine, to give us some wisdom in this time?
Yeah, so there's a lot that one could point to, but I'm reminded of the significance of rhetoric in early Christian theology. I'm writing a book at the moment on Augustine's use of classical rhetoric to construct an idea of martyrdom. And I mention rhetoric because for Augustine, who was trained as a teacher of rhetoric and did that professionally before he became a professional Christian, rhetoric is not something that is inherently problematic, but it is inherently dangerous. Augustine is famous, if for nothing else, and for the idea of original sin, right? And without getting into too much detail, we can take from it this idea that we're all screwed up in one way or another, in ways that have nothing to do with explicit choices we have made. For Augustine, the screwed upness has to do with a imperfect love and this desire that we have in general that is inherently misdirected. It doesn't know where to go. It should go towards God and neighbor, but because of this sin, it's like a warped arrow. Now, what does rhetoric have to do with this? Well, rhetoric for Augustine is what works to sway that arrow and redirect it. And so there is a role for Christian rhetoric, but also a way in which rhetoric is part of the world when the world is seen as a problematic place. So what we have when we're looking at problems in the world, like the insurrection last week, or the rise of white supremacy, or the continued rise of white supremacy, is in part the long-term effects of a rhetoric that appeals to our common sinful nature, but to some people in a particular way, that has so shaped their desire and view of the world that certain actions, certain opinions seem natural. They seem good. And there are two things that I take from this. One is the progressive Christian movement has to create, and in many ways already has, but has to create a compelling, competing vision. We have to have an articulation of what the kingdom of God looks like, of what human responsibility looks like, what the gospel means, that is not simply just, but also beautiful, because it is that beauty that will persuade and draw. And the second thing that this brings to mind for me is that Augustine's use of rhetoric, when he is trying to woo his congregation to what he understands the proper Christian life to look like, you can see it in a particular sermon, right? But it doesn't happen in a single sermon. It happens over a 30-year career with thousands of sermons preached. And so when we look at issues like the insurrection of the Capitol or white supremacist actions and terrorism and other related things, we have to realize that it's not one person who causes it. It's not Trump that creates this. He's part of it, right? He's part of flaming this rhetoric, but Trump would not be able to use that rhetoric if it hadn't already been stoked for decades at the very least. And so what we're looking at is a complex living rhetorical tradition that we are fighting against. And so that makes it that much harder to undo, but it also, I think, can give us a sense of the long view of what the progressive Christian movement's role is.
In terms of the work of religious rhetoric and leadership, I think that's such a helpful kind of guide. So Adam, we often talk about how Eden Seminary is a school of the church. And I think for a professor of church history, that is a kind of a interesting idea, and would just ask you to reflect a little bit about the seminary's legacy as a school of the church and its contemporary mission as a school of the church, how you see that, and what about that intrigues you as a historian, and what about that gives you hope as a person of faith?
Yeah, thanks. When I think of being a seminary for the church, and I think of it from the perspective of a church historian or historical theologian, I think, well, the default is to think of, Gothic cathedrals with gorgeous stained glass and bells ringing, which I love those. But one of the things that I have learned to appreciate even more during my time at Eden is that being a school for the church does not limit us to the institution of the church, right? But in as much as we do serve the institutions, and we do, and that is our passion is also for the larger church as it is emerging and manifesting in new ways. So this causes me as a historian to think, oh yeah, the church has never been one thing, and it keeps mutating and changing into different forms and various expressions. House churches to Gothic cathedral to poor Franciscans to my own guy, John Wesley, saying, the world is my parish, when he wasn't allowed to preach in institutional church buildings. And so I think one thing that Eden during my time here and, following the Ferguson uprising and other movements in St. Louis and beyond, I've been able to recognize that the church is just as much in the UCC church down the street as it is in those streets, right? And so when I think about being a teacher within a seminary that is for the church, I am on the one hand committed to nurturing relationships with the institutions and providing resources for everyday church life, but I'm also committed to being attuned to where the church is moving and where the church is present outside of those walls. And one of the benefits of being at Eden is that those aren't things I would notice on my own naturally, right? I have colleagues and many, many students that are able to show that to me. So for me, being able to say to a student, this is how this might help you think theologically about work in a church building within a certain institutional framework, or without a job, working to organize freelance or doing bivocational work. That is where the church is at, and that is where I think we need to be attending more.
That was wonderful. Thank you, Adam.
I am a professor. I am a scholar. I am Eden.